Hi everyone. In this podcast style episode, my sister Bea and I discuss the Mars archetype via its mythology and astrology. And if you want to hear what next follows, which is the Jupiter archetype, you can find it at our podcast site via the web link or through any podcast app on your phone. You can check for these links in the description of this post. Enjoy.
Welcome to Archetypes and the Planets, where Kahr and I, Bea Gonzalez, invite you to think metaphorically as we explore how we have collectively translated the map of the sky into our mythologies, religious systems, and personal psychology. So, Andre, last week we looked at Venus and the story to do with Venus, and this week we're looking at Mars. And Mars, just to start it off, was considered the lesser but malefic. Someone actually tried to argue with me one time, saying that the word malefic was not a real word. And I assured them, yes, it is a real word. Malefic meaning kind of the opposite of benefic, which is something that doesn't produce good results, shall we say, something that can bring bad luck. And in the ancient world, this was considered the lesser, and Saturn, obviously, the greater malefic. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking that if you're going to relate it to the stories, which is what I'm interested in and what I've tried to do, it's interesting that Venus, do you remember that Venus Athena emerges from Zeus's head, fully clothed in her armor? And she is related very much, I think, more to the Libra. I think Venus Aphrodite is more Taurus, but just stick with Athena because it's really interesting. Do you know how Mars emerges? Aries and the Aries in the Greek formulation. Mars emerges because, the way he is birthed is through Hera's rage. Now, Hera is the consort, wife / partner of Zeus, the head god. And she finds out he's produced Athena, and she is completely ticked off. So in her rage, she creates Mars on her own. So just like Venus comes out of Zeus's head, we now have Hera, his consort, creating Mars out of her rage on her own. So one of the ways to look at Mars, and this is pointed out, I think, by Howard Sasspertas or maybe Liz Green, is that Mars is a planet that doesn't benefit from the wisdom that you usually have in the solar principle. Because let's say that Mars is, to begin with, a yang planet, a masculine planet, although we all have it. Let's always stress that these planets and these archetypes belong to all of us. It doesn't matter what our gender is. But the fact is, again, we have a creation of a force, this time out of rage, which I think matches very well to what the Mars archetype is, by somebody in a rage. And then we have this planet, which I think you can give us the significations. But what's really interesting, what I'm going to talk about as we progress through this conversation, is how many stories Mars is aligned to. Okay, where he is kind of the dumb jock, just to put it in a kind of a so very, very powerful in terms of great athletic ability, let's say, or a great warrior, but not particularly smart. And I want to bring this up before we get to the significations, just to set it up in that. One of the reasons I'm interested in this, as I said in the first episode, is that I'm interested in the idea that this may be the mother mythology. And I'm also interested in the work of many people who comment that something changed in the period around where we had the first text being written or recorded, and that would be around 700 BCE, where we had the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I'll talk about the Iliad later because it is super important to what this story is about. And what changed is we went from a more feminine, connected kind of way of apprehending things to more masculine, directed, which I think Mars has a lot to do with, but also much more warrior-like. And the values that became important were Mars-like values, solar values. So one of them is being a good warrior. So that's number one, being a good warrior. But also by the time you get to 500 BCE and Athens, then you get the idea of also the competition, the Olympics, the idea that you have these great athletes and it's a matter of excellence. So just to set it up, maybe you can jump in now and tell me what you associate, what the significations are of the actual planet, and how you see it, and then we'll talk about the stories around it. So jump in.
Yeah, well, Mars for sure relates to, rules muscle. Mars is muscle, literally. And so athletics, warriorship, and when you said rage, definitely anger, irascibility, and including violence. It's a really aggressive planet. That's why it's the god of war. I mean, pretty clear.
Right.
Make no bones about it. That's what it is. And in fact, I'll notice it in my own chart that when I get any kind of Mars aspect, including any of the 248, so it can be conjunct, opposed, square, semi-square. If anything like that is happening, I will get really combative thoughts. Really, the mind tries to drift into, I'm going to do something really aggressive. Then the only thing that saves you from picking up a spear or worse is that your mind presumably is self-aware enough to say, oh, okay, yeah, Mars is paying me a visit. But that's the nature of the planet. When you said malefic, it reminds me, the Spanish malo. Yeah, it's malo. It's no, it's bueno, it's malo.
It's malo. Yes.
So and you see it, the other thing with Mars is that you see it in, kind of malefic occurrences like, the idea, of course, that if maiming and killing and fighting, that's generally considered more malefic. Although when you talk about sports, in a way, it's getting sublimated now, because now you're not necessarily killing the other person, you're just winning in the battle. And still, though, to me, Mars, one of the, I think, interesting ways to gauge what it's like is, Jared Diamond's famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. That's Mars. And he's telling you that civilizations, in a sense, progress through Mars, although it's become more subtle in that now it's, countries that are nuclear armed versus not, and things like that. But at the tip of a spear, at the idea that every advancement came when people developed tools, sharp tools. Steel is Mars, too. Anything pointy, a weapon. And then that would be the Aries side of Mars. The Scorpio side is the germs.
The germs.
Which
Yes.
is... So it's and by the way, that's not invented. You get the idea of getting infections and fevers under Mars is very, very common, right?
Right.
So it definitely has that quality to it. The only thing I can say on the other side that is also very helpful around Mars is that you don't do anything unless Mars launches you into action. So this is where, for example, Mars is said to be exalted in Capricorn, because Capricorn stabilizes the energy. If you put Mars in a mutable sign, the person roams a lot and doesn't finish things, and so forth. So Mars is essential, and yet it's definitely a difficult force.
Right.
No question. Yeah.
Right. So a couple of things to pick up from what you said. The sublimation is really, really important, because I think anybody who is into sports or has been at a sporting event will see that it has a little bit of a quality that maybe might have been a gladiator's field at one time. What you're doing is you're taking, and I think this is why people love sporting events. They're able to take their rage, and now they're able to aim it at the opposite, the opposite team. I don't know if I mentioned it to you last time, but what comes to mind was a recent thing that happened in a Tottenham Arsenal game. These are two Premier League teams who were playing, and they have, because they're from the same city, London, they get very angry at each other. They're fans. And what happened is one fan, when Tottenham lost, went and actually kicked the Arsenal goalie in the back of the leg, like hard enough that it was. And I thought, this is such irrational behavior, but it shows you that what you're taking is that rage, you're going into it. Now, the more appropriate way is you just, you scream, you holler, and then you get out of there and you let it go. But a lot of people carry this almost on a personal level. So I think sports are actually quite important as a vehicle for allowing people in the proper way, not the way this gentleman did it, but in a way to process all of that rage. Because Mars is, like every other planet, a servant to the sun, and you need the will that Mars gives you and the energy that Mars gives you to be effective with your sun for your solar path, right? Now, the other issue that you brought up is this notion, we all have a Mars. I think, whether male, female, but I do think women are socialized to have a little bit more problem with Mars. They own their rage, they own their assertiveness. And I think that, the rage is the shadow side. I think assertive assertiveness is definitely belongs to Mars. And so what I find really interesting is how many people I know who are quite outwardly placid and yet get in a car and become insane. And I'm wondering if that's another way that we the Mars out, you know, when no one's looking.
Mars and Gemini. Mars and Gemini, right?
Yes. Yes, there should be a lot of road rage.
Yeah,
right now because
the American chart has Mars and Gemini. Maybe that's why there'll be like Los Angeles road rage and whatever, like all kinds of cities where you get into it and then the person pulls a gun out and starts shooting.
Well, and actually Mars and Gemini also speaks to rage with words, right? There's a lot of raging within ideas and words. But you know, the important thing is that no planet, even when it is designated a benefic like Venus or a malefic like Mars, is totally good or totally bad. They have shadow sides, and Mars can be more difficult because I think what you said is true. If it's badly handled, it could lead to people doing murderous things. You know, so it's something especially if it's in contact with another planet, then you've got a really big problem ahead of you if you don't know how to channel it properly. But you do need it. It's an essential energy you need, and properly challenged, it's great. It's heroic. And you know, one thing I was thinking about, and you know this chart as well, you know, my big interest is mythology, and I was thinking of Joseph Campbell being an Aries ruled by Mars, with the I think 3 planets in Aries, including the Sun and Mercury in a Kazemi situation, is a very strong Mercury. What did he do? He planned the hero's journey. And I think that's really important with Mars too, that there's a journey that Mars has to take. There's a heroic journey. And of course, that's the solar path, but Mars is very, very involved in how that looks. Because if you think about it, in the tropical zodiac, Aries is the first sign of the zodiac. So Mars is what gets us going. It goes, okay, you have to take action, right? You can't do it from Taurus, because Taurus is sitting around fixed and not particularly interested in that, taking that first step. So it's a very strong cardinal energy, and it moves forward and it takes the first step. How you manage it afterwards, that's going to depend on what kind of state the Mars is in, or what transit you're in, or whatever, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it probably around what you said around assertiveness. Assertiveness, it's a difficult concept to explain without drifting into the disharmony of assertiveness, because assertiveness and aggression are pretty close to each other. So then you could argue that in Aries, it'll be more easy or easier to become assertive very quickly. Although the joke there is that the Aries will become assertive very quickly and then drop it, because it's not really a like resentment thing, and deep resentment, you're not letting me assert. It's just like an impatience. You say it. Whereas in Scorpio, the assertiveness there through Mars is a lot more long lasting and a lot more dangerous in the sense of holding resentments, right? But you can see how it could also be a lot more powerful in that assertiveness really should be say your piece, or really stand your ground. Stand your ground. Like it's the idea that says, no, you say X, thank you for your opinion. This is what I believe. And maybe you don't say anything more. It's the idea that Mars reflecting the will in terms of where you're coming from, and not being drawn into the other person's point of view when it doesn't suit you, right? Which would be, for example, why maybe Mars and Libra might do that to please the other person. And that's why they say Mars is better off somewhere else, and so forth. But all of these, for sure, relate to Mars, including when you said the journey of the sun. I often think of the Kabbalah where they draw the tree and the sun is in the center. That's your target. It's where you're going, your heart, your spiritual heart, the center of everything. And the left side, you see Mars, Saturn, and Mercury. And particularly Saturn and Mars, they're harsh energies. Mercury just takes whatever is around it for the most part. But Mars and Saturn for sure as the difficult energy, where you see Venus, Jupiter, Neptune on the other pillar, right? But you can't really go through one or the other. You have to find a balance. Otherwise, there's a runaway energy. But bottom line, again, there's no question. I mean, this is where a person says, well, I really want to understand what Mars is. Just track your astrology enough to run into a Mars square to something, and you will know immediately.
or find people who have that in their natal charts. I was thinking of John McEnroe having Mars Moon conjunct square,
Square Pluto.
Square Pluto, right? So this is yes, on the one hand, a great athlete, on the other hand, notorious for just blowing up on the court. One thing that you were bringing up on the issue of cooling and hot, right? Mars is considered a very hot planet. It's interesting that it is exalted in Capricorn, ruled by Saturn, which we associate with coldness. It's during the coldest part of the year. And so maybe why it's exalted there is a contemporary, as you say, contemporary the Mars, so that it is a bit more bounded. It's not as crazy. It's able to be more rational and measured, because I think Saturn has a certain level of measure. It can be measured in a way that Mars can't be. So that's probably, I'm thinking, why it can be. But it's interesting, in the myths that are around Mars, and the heroic figures that are really important to the Greek mythological system, which, by the way, is important to us because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a system that was created at that time. So you really want to get to know the stories. So the only thing that can tame Mars in those stories is Venus, right? Again, we're talking about that polarity because Mars in both signs that rules, both Aries and Scorpio, opposes the Venus and Taurus and Libra. So you always bring in Venus to tame Mars because Venus is relational and it knows it can't overstep in certain ways. And so I'm reminded of the concept of Venus associated with love. And there is, in the 19th century, Richard Wagner created this monumental cathedral of a work, an 18-hour opera that you see over 4 nights, that most people will never see because it's too extreme. He was an extreme person. But what was interesting about what he did is he created a character based on a fairy tale. And I think all of these things, the myths and the fairy tales, are all linked. And that character, Siegfried, which is, by the way, a hero, just like Achilles and Heracles and a whole bunch I'll talk about today. What's interesting about that hero is all her heroes in this tradition do not feel fear. That is why they are. But that kind of makes them dumb, right? Because part of what we should, as human beings, be able to do is feel fear, because that's actually what keeps us alive. So if you don't feel fear, you may be very heroic, but you're not really helping yourself. So in the case of Siegfried, he's raised in the forest. He's this big brawny guy, and he's able to kill the dragon that holds the ring. The ring cycle by Wagner has a lot of correspondences to those people who like the Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of correspondences. So he takes the ring, but before he takes it, he bathes in the dragon's blood, and he misses a part, the back, just like Achilles with a heel. It means there's a part that's vulnerable in Mars that you have to be very careful, the part they can't see, because it's always the back or the back of the heel or the heel. So it's some part that they're not really aware of. And so he does this, and then he thinks, well, I'm not afraid. How can I feel fear? You know how he feels fear? He sees a woman. He's never seen a woman before. And he sees a woman encircled by fire, and of course, fire again. He crosses the fire, and when he falls in love with her, he feels fear. And that is so interesting to me that it becomes human. Mars becomes humanized by the act of falling in love, which I think corresponds very well to that polarity of Venus and Mars. And by the way, that is what makes that work so absolutely great, because you think this is a great mythological, and it's in a lot of mythological stories. That is not the only one. Like I said, he took it from, not that particular story, but he took the idea of a fearless warrior from the fairy tales as well. And so I think that's really tied in to how these two always have to work together. It's not one or the other. And in fact, when they can't bring the Venus in, I think Mars is at a disadvantage. So it's harder when you have a square between those two planets or an opposition, because bringing those two together is going to be more difficult. Those two that naturally work together. Does that ring true to you?
It does absolutely, because you go to other topics like the idea of incorporating males incorporating the Venus into their psyche, so they're not projecting the Venus and in a sense becoming captive of Venus through the image of the female they're drawn to, or vice versa, where a woman can disown her Mars and then project it outside and search for it that way. The idea is to incorporate that within yourself, whether you're male or female. So in a sense, there's an androgyny of sorts when you get both planets, because they're both aspects of the psyche. And you can see in the current era, the Martial runaway, like when you think of something like testosterone, that's Mars. Excess testosterone, it's the idea that it's as a hormone or as a martial something or other, you're jutting out, you're moving out into the world. And it's something, I even saw this thing where if elephants go through this stage where they have too much testosterone, they're extremely dangerous to approach because they will kill you. You know, you even see this fluid, you know, on the side of their ears, and that warns you, stay clear, because it's like, then they're elephants with a spear, but I mean, like a really, really bad attitude, right? The idea of extreme Mars. So, but then this can be, you know, that whole idea of toxic masculinity, that's the idea of a runaway Mars, where there isn't really any Venusian energy in there, you know, to calm you down, to you know, to help you realize, hey, I'm supposed to be relating here, Venus, and maintaining harmony, peace, you know, what Venus does, versus all out attack, all out war, machismo, all of that is martial, right? So that fits really well. And although when you said the hero, I mean, part of that is that if you think about it, Mars through Aries gets associated with spring. Spring is when life is emerging, and in a sense it's taking a chance. It's still too young to be strong, but it has to get out there and start to grow and take chances. And that's what the hero does. That's why pioneering is associated with Mars and with Aries. Right. Going into an unknown to see what can be done, what can be conquered, what can be understood. So it's really valuable that way, unless it's unbalanced. It becomes too strong, in which case then it becomes disharmonious.
It's so interesting for two things. First of all, that in all the fairy tales, which really were instruction manuals for human beings to be able to know how to not only behave but evolve, because they really speak to how we change through life. The thing that women are always being entrusted to do in those fairy tales is to sort of metaphorically use the sword, which is something we associate with Mars. Mm-hmm. And the sword can be, obviously it's considered a phallic symbol, but it's another thing. It distinguishes, it separates things. And one of the things Venus, or even more the feminine, has an issue with, and I think more with the moon, just as a general principle, is it doesn't know how to distinguish what is important from what isn't. That is a problem with the feminine, because they merge with everything. So the sword, the Mars energy, helps you understand, or a psyche, it doesn't matter if it's man or woman, a psyche who is too steeped in that feminine energy, to say, hey, that's why they're always sorting grains. That's why they're always sorting fish or something. They're given that task because it's very difficult for them to distinguish what is important from what is not important. And when I say them, I mean the feminine psyche, not women, because obviously this will play out differently in each person. But that's why it's such an important symbol, and why it shows up in all our stories. The sword is not only used to conquer, it's used for, I think, the highest quality, or the highest expression of the masculine, which is the word discernment. It can differentiate between what matters and what doesn't matter. On the issue of toxic masculinity, you can almost say that what's interesting about the whole astrological story is that it is tracking for you what we've been developing over the last 2,000 years, which is a solar, principally solar, very masculine kind of approach. And when I think of what goes on, and we're all subjected to this, so we see it, I think of that the first story we have in the Western canon, we are practicing a Western astrology, this is not Vedic, is the story of the Iliad, which is basically a war, right? And we've already talked about what this has to do in that war for Aphrodite with the apple and whatever. But the part that we haven't talked about is that one of the most important characters in that story is the character of Achilles. And Achilles is a warrior who goes into a snit, because what happens is he's supposed to fight for the Greeks against the Trojans, and he gets ticked off that the leader of the army, Agamemnon, the king Agamemnon, has taken his concubine. So he basically says, I'm not going to fight. You've taken my dignity away. And this is kind of a martial thing where you pull a snit. I refuse to act because you've offended me. And he sits. And that's why the Greeks aren't winning the war, because he basically refuses to fight. And once he does fight, of course, they do win. And then he is, by the way, killed this is the famous story. The only way that he's vulnerable is through a heel. He's shot through the heel by Paris and he dies. But what's interesting about it is just the snit, the idea that I'm not going to do it. I do it my way, or not at all. And yet I always tell people to read the Iliad, because there is one scene in the Iliad that kind of humanizes Achilles, and it is through love. And it's not of a man-woman love or male-female. It's the love of, after he has killed the Hector, who is the big hero of the Trojan War, the Trojan side, he won't give the body back to the father to be buried because he's so ticked off because Hector has killed his best friend. And so the father comes, the old father Hector comes and begs Achilles and goes through the war lines and says, please just give me the body of my son so I can mourn him and bury him properly. And in that moment, it humanizes Achilles. And what he says is, he says, think of your own father and how your father would feel. And in that moment, Achilles says, here, yes, you can take the body. And he even washes the body and has it taken away. And it's that moment that you see, okay, this absolutely, big kind of like Brad Pitt type of warrior, like, I guess it's not Brad Pitt, I don't know, whoever it is. Anyway, Russell Crowe. Suddenly, yes, see, you can tell I don't watch too many movies. But the point is that he softens up and through an act of compassion becomes very human. And that again is that balance that you can't just have the sword. You just can't have the honor, because that's another word that Mars loves. Honor. You've offended my honor, and therefore I must now fight you to the death. It's the idea that on its own is dangerous because it's all ego driven, right? It's all, well, I must get my revenge, but there's no love in it. And I guess again back to that polarity that is so important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that Mars would be considered, I would understand it as one of the most relevant symbols around the being captured by the ego force, in that when you think of ego in a certain way, it has a density to it. There's a sense of isolation when you think of ego. And what I mean by ego there, ego on the downside. Like, in other words, for example, this is why anger is so destructive, because if you get angry enough in a situation at another person, there'll be a recovery period before you get your expansion back.
Right.
During that period, it's like, you're just, you can't. It almost reduces your energy, coalesces it. It becomes a very body. I'm my body and nothing else. That's all I am. I'm here to survive. It's that muscularity of Mars, which, by the way, nature itself is very much like that. Dog eat dog. It's people sometimes say about compassion. Well, compassion, bring it up around humans. Humans show compassion. It is pretty limited in the animal world because it's all about surviving. And so then when you think of the archetypes in astrology, humans embody multiple animals. That's the whole idea, that you've got the fish archetype and you've got the bird archetype and the goat archetype and so forth. But there is an animal nature, and then there's this evolving trend to become human, which whatever that is, right? But I had to laugh at seeing this recently. I saw this little video with they were showing a kangaroo flexing its muscles to attract females. It was doing the same thing as a jock at a gym, and yet that is part of our culture. And we also see, if you look around, I think humanity is evolving away from that. In other words, yes, for the most part, the larger group of people agree that now it's more about brain power and awareness and some other quality that supersedes, I can just punch you out and kill you, and therefore I'm more desirable that way. Yeah, except that isn't going to necessarily bring you the same powers that it used to when you were, living in the wherever. So in that sense, Mars, even though we may be you were saying we may be in a solar period, and the idea of war, the idea of aggression, I think that's part of the reason, by the way, why the whole world is so horrified at Putin these days, because he's using way too much Mars. This is crazy to approach something through just pure violence. I'm going to solve it through violence.
So that's great, because you just brought up, you talk about how the world we're evolving to choose something different. Going back again to these stories that starts off the Western tradition, there's another story of another warrior on the other side that I think may point to that. So when the Trojan War finishes in this great big epic, the people triumphant are the Greeks, not the Trojans. And on the Greek side, there is a great warrior besides Achilles. Achilles is now dead, and his armor, this is very important, the armor, if you think of what you carry on you, it's like your persona, has to be bequeathed to another warrior. So you're almost carrying the potency of the dead warrior. So Ajax feels he was the next best warrior, he should get it. But Menelaus, the king, gives it to Odysseus. And what does Odysseus have? Remember, Odysseus is the cunning one. He is the guy that came up with the Trojan horse that tricked the Trojans into opening the gates, and that what basically led to their downfall. So what was rewarded was cunning, not victory on the battlefield. Okay. Now here's the interesting thing. Ajax comes home and he is in such a rage. Think of Mars. He's in such a rage that he did not get this armor that he plots to kill all three of them. Agamemnon, Menelaus, the brother, who is the husband of Helen, who they went to get, and Odysseus. He's that ticked off. Athena, now here's the interesting part, comes down and puts him in a spell. And instead he goes around in a rage killing cattle, not understanding that they're cattle, thinking that they're the people he wants to. When he comes out of that rage, he is so embarrassed, and shame comes up, because shame, I think, is a shadow side as well. You're ashamed if you are not living up to heroic ideals. He is so ashamed, he commits suicide. He goes out and he falls on a sword. Then the sword to basically, get rid of his pain, of all the shame. And I think, yes, what was rewarded there was the intellect. It wasn't the brawn, and we have evolved. But I think evolved, I'm not even sure that's a word, because the intellect can also has created more problems than anything in its own way. But the idea is that the value system was moving already to a state where philosophy, math, all the things that we culture was valued. But you can't avoid what you say about the kangaroo is right, and this is where Jung was very, very prescient. He kept saying most neurosis is caused by human beings ignoring their instinctual self. The fact that although we have this lovely overlay where we can do math and sing songs and write poetry, you're still an animal. You have instincts that if you go against them will actually hurt you. You have to be attending also to both. It's not an either or. It's a way to approach both. And we all have an aggressive instinct. If we can sublimate it or transform it through muscular, you keep saying muscular. Well, one way to do it is go work out, right? Go move the body, and maybe the anger turns into something that the body can process and you can move forward. I mean, that is one way, right? But to ignore the fact that we are, and we see it because I think Mars belongs to the terrible twos. Anyone who's had a toddler around can see that moment in time when they start raging because they want to do things that are beyond their capabilities. And so you can't ignore that that's there. That's a human impulse. And I think part of the problem, and I think it's happened, is that we have ignored it. We try to act like it's not there. The other thing, by the way, too, is that it can be extreme. It let out without any kind of guardrails. It is what we're seeing in the toxic side, that you get this idea that no, it's all good. And by the way, this is an imbalance problem. I think what's going on with this toxic masculinity issue is that there's a reaction to, they always say, because, there's always an excuse. It's a reaction to being told, I can't do this. I can't do that. I can't say this. I can't be a racist openly. That's a terrible twos problem, isn't it? It's what the kid says. I need to have what I want. Well, no, you can't, because you live in a world where others, Venus, exist as well. And we share our universe and we share a world. And I think this is not being in proper contact. On the one hand, these are the same type of people that tell you to, pull weights and do all sorts of things to look muscular. And yet they're behaving completely unconsciously and hurting people through words, through actions, because of their inability to connect to their own feminine. It has nothing to, they keep blaming women. It has nothing to do with that. It's an interior job all the way, like it always is, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's Mars. It's Mars running amok. One other thing about Mars is that if you connect it to Aries and Scorpio, and you assign muscle more to Aries as the first house, body, but then blood is Mars. Blood is a liquid that flows within muscle. It's the life force, literally. It's very, very important. The quality of that will determine how you feel. But just so, the whole notion of killing, maiming, all of that is, you're spilling blood. People immediately recognize that, danger, right, violence, all of that is Mars, including, and this is interesting, because what I noticed with astrology, why it's one thing to say you observe Mars in someone else, that's good, and yet, to my mind, never matches the feeling when you observe it in yourself, because it becomes an organic thing. So, in my own learning about it, by my inclinations, by what I'm tuned to. And a while back I discovered Mars is actually a carnivore energy. You get more of an instinct to eat meat, for example, which is, and it lasts just through the period of the of the aspect, right?
Right.
And again, it tells you that this is the way nature works. I mean, people think humans are cruel. You have no idea. Just turn on the Planet channel and watch it for a little bit, and you'll go, "Oh my God!" I mean, they are just brutal to be like,
Yes.
beyond brutal. It is just like the worst nightmare that you can
You
imagine.
mean animals? You mean animals? Right?
Animals, the way they treat each other
Well,
within their terrain. There are zero rules, and it's total, the kind of thing beyond cruelty. If you were to make a movie about humans behaving this way, you would say this like I'm watching a total horror show because of the way they treat each other, right? And that's very martial in that sense. The pinnacle of the idea of the animal realm. It's all primitive survival. Whoever is stronger
right.
survives, and whoever not doesn't. Even within an animal population, it'll be the strongest animals. That's why, for them, it is perfectly valid to say, well, the kangaroo wants to find a mate that is strong, because that's the instinct to then propagate the kangaroo, race or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, I mean, the only thing would be there you'd have to explore some interesting segues, like how certain animals, it's about the coloring, like peacocks and things like that. There you get more into Venus, but still, it's very dominant because you still have to survive.
Right.
If there are predators that come after you, then you won't make it.
I will say that I think that the reason most people will say that humans can be much faster, crueler than animals is animals. Yes, they will be. They need to survive, and they honor the survival instinct and territory because they need to procreate. They're really they're biological, and that's it. But I think we'd all agree that humans that can come up with the concept of, Auschwitz are much more dangerous because they've used the one thing we've been gifted, which is the ability to consciously decide to absolutely torture other humans. Yes. And at that point, it makes us a lot worse. Because animals, they're trying to survive. I understand that. You got to survive any way you can. And you're procreating because you have a biological impulse to do that. But what humans do with the gift we've been given of consciousness or lack of consciousness is a pretty scary thing. And they do it mostly through the Mars area because violence, I think, is more aligned to Mars than it is to any other planet. Because, again, it's an assertion of will. An assertion of will, and dominance is a word that also comes into,
That's true. Although you could also counter that by saying, as the centuries have moved forward, and in particular, once the outer planets were discovered, and there may be a clue in there, in that
yes, we'll get to that.
Uranus maybe humanizes people a lot more than they think, because post that point, if you commit atrocities, generally the race does not approve. It says this is not cool. We have to get rid of this, because they could be saying, in the world right now, we could all be saying, no. Really, the idea is to be really physically strong, and whoever beats up the other person is the king of the hill. That's not how it works.
Well, so some are saying that. Let's be clear.
I know.
Some believe this, which is scary.
I know, including.
Let's not be naive about this at all. Right?
Yeah, no. I mean, I know, I get it, but it's that logic that I know. I mean, but you could even bring up Marjorie Taylor Greene and say even women think this way.
Sure,
some women,
of course, because it's Mars. It's not a woman-man thing. Is we all have Mars.
Exactly, Mars. So, but it's still interesting to see that, by and large, I mean, you think of billions of people living on the planet, and the race seems to disapprove. We'll see. I mean, time will tell. My feeling is no. My feeling is that, and like the energy of Uranus in that sense, the discovery of that really jams that particular impulse and brings in this other thing that is, in a sense, more nervous system oriented and less muscular. It goes to a deeper part of the psyche and says, no, that's more valuable. That's what we should be honoring, right? But yet, even so, you still have a Mars. Like, you can have any nervous system you want in terms of you doing anything, even walking about. The fact that you can go from one place to another. Mars is there, and when you're taking any action, it's there. When your ability to follow through, your ability to take action is Mars.
Action, which you need. And we go back to the fact that nobody's saying they said the malefic. The last thing is that the ancients thought that Mars had its joy in the sixth house. Planetary joys were where the house, the significations of the house comes from the planet, the joys there. So Venus, we said in the fifth. And they didn't like the sixth house, and they didn't like the 12th house, and they liked the eighth. And the reason they didn't like any of those houses it's a question of light. The ascendant can't see those houses by a Ptolemaic aspect. And what's interesting about those houses is, and we'll get to that when we eventually get to the house segment of this, archetypes and the houses, is that they can't be seen means that they're a little bit unconscious, aren't they? They're a little bit they're driving you in ways that you're not really aware of. So it's a little bit dangerous. But in the sixth house specifically, it is aligned with health, right? To a certain degree, it's aligned with how your body functions or how it doesn't function, with sickness, with ailments. And so when you said about Mars and its connection to fevers, which it definitely is because you heat up and that's it, then that is immediate. Oh, and wounds, like you think of wounds, right? Open wounds. Yeah, it's pain. It's why that's not it's a house that, of course, there's no good and bad. There's good and bad and everything. But I mean, I'm sorry, there's no exclusively bad. There's good and bad. But it's interesting that it was associated with that house. It's comfortable in that house, just like Saturn in the 12th. And so you think to yourself, there is something about Mars that is also associated in some way with pain. You take they're all, every planetary archetype is going to have that. But in this case, I associate it specifically with the physical side of pain, injury, like you say, fevers, anything that actually puts your body in a state which is pain, and nobody likes it. It's really hard. Mm-hmm. Done consciously, you could turn that pain and turn it into a marathon run, which is also painful, but you accomplish something, you set out a goal. So there are ways to look at pain differently, but I would say that it's difficult on that level as well, that there is something to do with physical pain and Mars being involved at times.
Some of those I don't always totally understand when something will get put somewhere and said to be happy. Venus in the 5th, to me, makes more sense than Saturn or Mars in 6-12. Although Saturn, you could say, because it could be used for spiritual growth, and it's a great disciplinarian and so forth. And Mars, the one thing I can think of with Mars in the 6th would be that it can, because it's a vital energy, it can vitalize you as a result of being there. It's just that you always have to look at charts really carefully. So if you see Mars there and it's got 2 squares, or even a single square, can completely pen that logic, and so you have to study it carefully to make sure. But as an overall principle, sure, you could point to it. And those houses you mentioned, the absence of light. Well, the fact that they're related to health and death gives you the clue as to why, and that's not made up. I mean, the idea of planets going through the 6th and needing to go to the doctor to repair something is very common, and needing surgery in the 8th, also very common. Yes. I see this repeatedly, where people will say, I'm going to do surgery, and you see planets moving into the 8th, or they report health things through the 6th. So calling them malefic, and then in the 12th, as soon as you know it rules hospitals, you pretty much know, okay, that's where things can get a little sticky, right? Yeah,
and this is the whole fate idea, that there's parts of your life that you cannot control, even though we'd like to. There is the particle wave thing again, that you can't control everything, but you can control, maybe you can develop your consciousness to understand and accept maybe some things, but those are hard things. And I think when they said planetary joys, it didn't mean that Mars is happy in the 6th house. It means that Mars and the significations of the 6th house are related. But that doesn't mean that you have Mars in the 6th and it's a happy camper. No, it just means that there is a relationship between those two. I note that nothing actually joys in the 8th, possibly because they didn't have access to the outer planets, and perhaps Pluto may joy in the 8th. They just didn't know, because at the time they were developing the system according to what was visible to them in the sky. Anyway, so I think that's pretty comprehensive about Mars. We're basically telling people, be aware you have one. It's great for getting things done. It's great for taking action, but the shadow side is out of control. It can be cruel, and it can be aggressive, and it can hurt you and others. So it's an energy that needs a lot of management, but you can't do without it. It's not like, it's one of those things that done well, it gives you great courage, great initiative, and action. You got to take action to make things happen. So there you are. So next time,
my final thought is that that's a planet that has a 2-year orbit. Right. I believe the average speed, so it has to be such that it's going to take 2 years to get around. So it's going to be, if you think of the sun 1 degree per day, the Mars energy has to be an average of maybe like half a degree. So it's a planet that you can track in your chart because it makes aspect connections infrequently enough that you can, isolate a period and go, okay, I got Mars now for a few days. And the idea is, what are you feeling? What are you sensing? One of the things I've noticed in myself, in my journey to try to understand my Mars, is that I notice my combativeness, my sense of feeling aggression within myself is almost precisely linked to how irritable I feel in my body for whatever reason. What have I done to create the irritability? For example, if you didn't get enough sleep, that'll create irritability, and then there's this impulse to push it out. It happens every so often that I might get irritable for no reason, but that's pretty rare. For the most part, it feels like it emerges as an impulse from within through body irritability, and then being expressed through then what? In other words, it's the idea that irritability in the body leads to irritable thoughts and emotions. That literally, like the people that you don't like seem to pop up in your mind and think, that person, that other person.
Well, this just to close with that's really something we didn't mention. It isn't really all that odd that you will not play your Mars, you will draw people to you that are playing the aggression card for you, right? In other words, if you're the kind of person that is too scared, isn't it amazing? Sometimes you're drawing people that are almost enacting that, and you're attracted to them because you need to work it out, but you can't work it through yourself, which is why I think all this work we do on ourselves is extremely important, because otherwise we project it and we allow other people to live it out, and we have no control at all when that happens. So it's much more healthy to say, okay, where am I and why am I irritable, and how do I take action in an appropriate way? Measured, right? Not overreacting it, but action you have to take, and you are going to have to be aggressive sometimes to get what you want, but not in, aggression doesn't have to be against. I think aggression is the wrong word. You just have to be able to make decisions and take actions that get you what you want. Bringing in, again, polarity. We've talked a lot about this. Then we have to finish by saying, if you bring in the opposite side, which is Venus, then you will understand your value system, understand where you need to take action, and also understand how not to trample over anybody else's rights, because we all coexist. We do. Exactly. So we have to share the little world we live in. So, okay, next time Jupiter, we go from the lesser malefic to the greater benefic. Everybody loves Jupiter until you get drunk. So anyway, we'll talk about that and how Jupiter can play both sides of the side as well, right?
All right, excellent. I look forward to that.
Next time. All right. Thanks for listening today. If you want to hear more about all of this, go to YouTube, where you will find Andre's channel called Astrology Alert. He posts videos there almost daily. He also teaches classes through his Patreon account. You can find me at sophiacycles.com. If you want to support my work, I've recently released a new novel called Invocation, which you may find of interest. Go to my website to see a book trailer about it. It's available in all fine bookstores, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Finally, if you like this podcast, please rate it and leave a review so that others will find it as well.